Donald Trump doesn't like drawn out wars. We've heard it from him so many times. We know that he thinks that they're unpopular. He's right, they are unpopular, and he would want to see maximum gains in this first stage of the campaign. If at some point in the next 2 or 3 days the Iranians come back to him and say through different brokers and say, look, prepared now for a much stronger deal, limiting or abolishing our nuclear program and our ballistic missiles program. I think Trump may take that and say, here you are, we've won. This is the big game. So whatever happens, they want to maximize the effect.
So let's get more now on the news that Israel and the US have launched strikes on Iran, with a US official telling the Reuters news agency that the attacks are being carried out by air and sea. Let's talk to the Economist Israel correspondent Anshel Pfeffer, who is in Jerusalem. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Chloe.
So what do we know about what is happening as we speak?
Well, we know that about an hour and a half ago, Israeli and American strikes apparently hit both in Tehran regime targets and in other parts of Iran, also military targets, apparently ballistic missile launchers or depots. We're not quite sure yet. And an hour and a half ago, Israelis were woken up by a nationwide siren and also their smartphones. They got messages on them to be close to a shelter. No indication yet of incoming Iranian missiles, but the warning is that they could be very soon.
And this is a joint Israeli and US operation, we understand. In fact, as I speak to you, I can see that President Donald Trump has posted an 8-minute video on his social media platform, Truth Social, confirming that the US is involved. What do we know about the coordination between that and indeed the timing of this?
Well, we do. Well, we know that they've been working together for many weeks now on preparing attack plans, and there obviously were different scenarios in which they looked at, in which, excuse me, sorry.
That's okay.
In which and both American and Israeli attack plans were worked over, and they've been doing it now for months. And at some point, I can only assume that Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu both agreed on carrying out this operation together. From what I understand, the rationale is that since Donald Trump wants this to be a short excuse me.
No, we understand it's a busy morning. We totally understand.
That the Americans, certainly the Americans, and I think also the Israelis, don't want this to be a long and drawn out war, and therefore they're concentrating as much of their firepower, of their efforts right now on this strike. I've been told that this is going to be a very intense next 48 hours with as much of both the Israeli and the American firepower here in the region. We saw the American buildup now for weeks of the hundreds of aircraft arriving and the warships and the 2 aircraft carrier groups. So you can only assume that both of them will, both these forces will be thrown into this. At the same time, there's also a lot of coordination over defense of American bases and of Israel, missile defense. So there's missile defense batteries. There are aircraft equipped with specific rockets to shoot down missiles in mid-flight. So all that is now in place. And we're still waiting to see what the Iranian response will be, how much of its significant capabilities Iran can still launch at this point. I can only assume that the first wave will have been targeting at least partly specifically those capabilities. But we'll have to wait and see how successful those strikes have been.
We spoke to a number of people this morning who've used the words of an idea of a limited war, and that is what the US administration wants. We also spoke to our correspondent, Summer Al-Trush, who is in the region a little bit earlier on, and he was saying there is a concern that there could be a view amongst the Iranian Revolutionary Guard of a kind of use it or lose it attitude with missiles, as happened with Hezbollah. They didn't use all of their missiles against Israel, and then they effectively had all of that arsenal wiped out. The Iranians may want to get on the front foot, particularly if it's going to be such an intense 48 hours. That does sound like there is a real possibility of, and this sounds ridiculous with war, but to say it could get out of hand.
Well, certainly. And Iran has a very large arsenal of missiles of different ranges. I mean, we saw back in the war in June, the 12-day war in June, they were firing mainly at Israel, but they also fired at some point at an American base in Qatar. So they have both these long range and these shorter range capabilities, and both the Americans and the Israelis will be aiming now to try and deny these capabilities as much as they can. But yes, if the Iranians do reach this kind of use it or lose it, or we're about to fall anyway, so we'll do everything, we'll use everything we have at our disposal, then that will be a very quick escalation here of matters. And once again, that is part of the reason, I think, why the Israelis and the Americans are going now all in with all the force that they have. And we've seen, and including last night, we've seen so many more American military aircraft arriving in the region. There's more now in the UK, which we believe are in transit towards coming here. Those two aircraft carrier groups. So there's a lot of firepower currently being concentrated on those Iranian capabilities, and it's basically a race for time from the Iranian perspective, see if they can launch those missiles at Israel and perhaps at American bases in other parts of the region before they lose them.
Just bring everybody an update, and do stay with us, Anshel, if you could. That Donald Trump has released that 8-minute video on Truth Social. He's described it as a major combat operation. He says the US military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation. We're going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. He says Iran is developing long-range missiles that threaten the US and others, and Iran attempted to rebuild its nuclear program. It can never have a nuclear weapon. Americans may be lost and we may have casualties. That is what Donald Trump has said in the last few minutes. There are huge regional implications here as well, aren't there, Anshel? And just talk us through the complexities and how this could engulf the entire region.
Well, let's first of all talk about the potential targets that the Israelis and the Americans have. There are, as you just quoted from Donald Trump, there is the nuclear program. Now, that was badly hit both by Israel and in America in June, but some of the infrastructure is still there. Some of it is buried deep underground, but it's there. And that is one of the targets, one of the potential targets of this campaign. And then there are the ballistic missile capabilities, which is the more immediate threat to the region. And it's not just coming from Iran. Iran has deployed its missiles through its proxies in other parts of the region, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Houthis in Yemen, and also there are pro-Iranian Iraqi militias which have these missiles. So that's also a consideration. Do these groups, do these proxies get in on the act? Does Iran say to them, this is why we gave you these missiles, now we want you to fire them? Or perhaps they'll say, well, actually, we don't want to be in this. We don't want to invite the wrath of the Americans and the Israelis upon us now. So that's another element that could come into play. Then there's the broader question of the region itself, of the regime itself. We have seen attacks in Tehran on what are probably our regime targets, though I don't think that the Americans and Israelis think that at this point they can use military means to take down the regime directly, because most of the main leaders will have by this point have been down in bunkers in places that perhaps are much more difficult for the Israeli and American warplanes to reach. And then there's the question of what else Iran can do. So Iran, as we said, can fire missiles both from Iran and using its proxies if they're prepared to be part of this, and they could fire them at Israel, as we saw in June, but they could also fire them at other countries in the region. And then there's the question of shipping in the Hormuz Strait. We saw in the past Iran acting to basically stop the flow of oil tankers from this region, which produce so much of the world's energy needs. So they could do that as well. I'm sure all these things have been taken into account. The question is, have the Americans and the Israelis got enough power and enough intelligence, and can they work fast enough to prevent these things from happening? But all these elements are now in play, and we'll see in the next hours and days which of them Iran chooses to use, and if they are still capable of using them.
Are we clear on the Israeli and US plan here? Is this about regime change in Iran, or is this about trying to get the Iranians back to the negotiating table in a weakened position?
Well, that's a great question. Nobody has. I haven't yet seen the full Trump's statement. But from the Israeli statement, they're not talking about regime change. They're talking about preemptive attack. The officials I've spoken to say we're first of all trying to deny Iran's capabilities to threaten Israel and to threaten other countries in the region. At the same time, they're saying, look, if this does lead to the toppling of the regime, we're not going to shed any tears over that. So what they are actually aiming at, well, we can listen to what they're saying, but we can also see that there have been attacks on regime targets. Now, that may be specifically on headquarters in Tehran, which are connected to Iran's military apparatus, but it could also be specifically to start weakening the regime. Now, Donald Trump doesn't like drawn out wars. We've heard it from him so many times. We know that he thinks that they're unpopular. He's right, they are unpopular, and he would want to see maximum gains in this first stage of the campaign. If at some point in the next 2 or 3 days the Iranians come back to him and say through different brokers and say, look, prepared now for a much stronger deal, limiting or abolishing our nuclear program and our ballistic missiles program, I think Trump may take that and say, here you are, we've won. This is the big game. So whatever happens, they want to maximize the effect of this first stage, because I think everybody understands that Trump will not doesn't want to have his forces in the region for much longer. He wants to, he's built them up, he sent them there, he wants to use them. He's using them now. But whether this will be a more sustained campaign, or is just another wave to try and bring the Iranians back to the table with, from America's perspective, a better deal, this is something we'll have to wait and see in the next 2 or 3 days.
Anshel, thank you so much for speaking to us. I'm grateful for your time. I appreciate it's a busy morning.
Bye.
That is the Economist Israel correspondent Anshel Pfeffer, who's speaking to us from Jerusalem.
So that is at the core of where we're at here. Is this about regime change or trying to manoeuvre Iran back into talks and in a position of weakness, really? So President Trump announcing, and by the way, just as a sidebar to this, he's posted this video online. I guess traditionally in something resembling this magnitude, US presidents would broadcast this on television at the same time.
A live address to the nation.
We will do an address to the nation at X time. Everybody gets ready and listens. But he's just posted it on the internet, so we'll let you hear that just as soon as we can. But he has announced that the US military has begun this major combat operation against Iran. Here's a quote: "Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime." He's blamed Iran for waging an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the US and its allies. He said, "It's been mass terror and we're not going to put up with it any longer." Just as another observation for you, President Trump has recorded this video, stood behind a lectern with the seal of the President of the United States. The backdrop is a US flag and a flag of the US President. He is wearing a suit with no tie and a white baseball cap that says USA on the front, is how he has chosen to address this particular issue.